Welcome everyone to this episode of Beyond the Crucible. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and you have clicked play on, we hope you've clicked subscribe to, a podcast that deals with what we call crucible experiences. Now, what are crucible experiences? You may be asking if this is perhaps the first time you've clicked play on, and we hope you click subscribe to our show. Crucible experiences are those things that happen in life, traumas, failures, setbacks, difficult situations that really can knock the wind out of our sails, that really can truly change the trajectory of our lives. But here's the good news about our show. We don't just talk about them so that we can build a virtual campfire and gather around it and swap war stories and sort of feel bad about where our crucibles have brought us. We talk about them here because we believe, and experience has shown us, that crucibles can be learned from, overcome, and move beyond. And that is the purpose of the show, is to help you move beyond your crucible, as the title of the show goes. And the host of the show and the founder of Crucible Leadership, I sometimes call him, and I'm going to do it again today, the Lego master of Beyond the Crucible, Mr. Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, welcome. Our guest today is fascinating to me. Listener, you're likely to hear a lot of the same words come out of Warwick's mouth and our guest's mouth today because, well, you'll hear why. And you'll understand why when I read our guest's bio. Our guest today is James Kelley, PhD, who is the co-founder of Q Change and is the international author of The Crucible's Gift, 5 Lessons from Authentic Leaders Who Thrive in Adversity. He's also a TEDx speaker. James has spent the last 15 plus years working in consulting, marketing, and higher education with a cross-section of leaders and organizations. James is the CEO of Q Change, which delivers signals for leadership growth at scale, and resides in Bend, Oregon with his wife, and count them, 4 children. Warwick, take it away.
Well, James, it's wonderful to be with you, and thanks so much for being on the podcast. We got in touch, I don't know if it was a few weeks ago, it wasn't that long, and it's just amazing. I love the title of your book, The Crucible's Gift, and mine's Crucible Leadership. It's like, okay, so yours was first, like 2018 or something. And so it's like, hey, what's going on here? But yeah, obviously, and you actually spent some time in Western Australia, which we'll get to in a moment. But obviously, my book is sort of anchored in my story and my crucible and the 150-year-old family media business. But I love the title of
in
your
Australia.
Book. Yes,
the 150-year-old family media business in Australia.
Absolutely. And so I love the title of your book, The Crucible's Gift, and we'll get to that in a moment because I've been thinking about that. Just recently, we had a Harnessing Resilience series on our podcast, and the word gift has come up. And so I've really been, because, Gary asked me, I don't know, a few months ago, do you just see what you went through as a gift? And I was like, not really. Yeah. But I've been changing my mind just recently to talk about continuous learning. Yeah. But before we get into the things of your book, tell us a bit about the origin story, the backstory of The Crucible's Gift, and how you came to write it. A bit about you growing up. You probably had a few crucibles, but the love of this book came out of somewhere, right? The desire to write this. So, talk about sort of the origin story.
Well, I just want to first start by saying thank you to both you guys for having me on today. And secondly, since my book came first with the word crucibles, I am requesting royalty fees on your book as you sell it, just to be clear.
There you go. That's so good.
The origin story of the book is never the book itself. It's the path leading to it, right? And hence your book. And so I found for myself that I'd always wanted to be better at leading, right? But I had a bunch of baggage. And I was really curious about how individuals or leaders that I interviewed, how they perceived their baggage and what they did with it, and how did they unpack it, and how did they refold it back in the luggage and keep moving forward. And so for me, it was really an interesting exercise of accepting what was, what is, and the possibilities of what could be. And so I went on this journey. I had a podcast for 3 years. And that's where all these interviews came from, was the podcast. And it was always about not what you do, but really who you are in your journey. And that's where I think it comes from. At the end of the day, just to say it succinctly, the origin of the book was me trying to unpack why I felt like I was failing as a leader, and how can I embrace my own crucibles as a springboard to the future.
And where did that come from, that sense of, gosh, I'm failing as a leader? And so talk a bit about maybe some of the crucibles you had. What led you to that kind of viewpoint of yourself, if you will?
I mean, clearly it's lack of self-esteem. We can start with that part. And so yeah, I just think I didn't have the best modeling as a child. Right. And so that's your framework of a house is your parents. And so the framework wasn't great. I often tongue in cheek say, I grew up in an Irish Catholic household, with a touch of violence, all the guilt, and no Catholicism. Right. So and it wasn't overtly violent. It wasn't like the worst house ever, but it was cold. My mom's Scottish Canadian, which just in itself, of an old school Catholic, is innately a bit cold. My dad, he was a product of a World War II vet who was at Pearl Harbor. So there's just a series of things that I think culminate together that left me not feeling great about myself over time. And then self-talk obviously is a huge part of that, negative self-talk.
Wow. So that is interesting. So, so you had that experience, and so what were some of the other beats to your Crucible stories that have moved on from that kind of family?
Yeah, so I think that the other thing that came up later in life is that I had a learning disability. So I think when all is you're bad at something, or you're not good at something, or you can't succeed at something, those seeds are planted quite young. In reflecting on my parents, and I always say this to my mom. My dad passed away when I was 20, and that we can talk about that. That definitely was a crucible. They did the best that they could with what they knew. So I don't hold any resentment towards them, but I'm still a product of that environment. I mean, there's a really vivid story. My dad, by all accounts, was a good human being but he's flawed. He's human. Mm-hmm. And I vividly remember the orange shag carpet with the wood paneling walls at our house growing up, very 70s chic, which would probably be really in style now anyways. But I remember my older brother, who was 16 at the time. My mom was married previously, and my dad married and adopted these two kids, which was great. Part of the adoption was that their biological father wanted nothing to do with them. And my dad agreed, and the guy was wealthy. But my dad was willing to take that on because my mom and he loved the kids. So my older brother, John, just has a series of problems, still does at 53 years old, a lot of problems. But I remember him and my dad were getting into it, yelling. And I vividly remember my dad pushing my brother down. My dad was a very intimidating individual. He grew up in the farms in Colorado, baling hay the old way with the hooks. So he had like Popeye forearms, like just this big, strong man. My brother John, is in puberty. At 16, could bench press 225, like 15, 20 times, squat 500 pounds, really big, but 5'8", right? So big and strong. And I remember them getting in a fight, and my dad pushed him into a chair. His fist was cocked back. My other brother, who was 14 or 15, who was 6'6'2", 200 pounds, was holding him back. I'm in the corner cowering down. My mom is screaming. And so those events didn't happen every week, but boy, they happened enough to make you afraid of male authority, to make you afraid of standing up, but I will say in that moment, the ability to say to yourself, boy, this is chaos. Boy, this is really, really unhealthy. I got that at 9, 10. There's some other stuff that happened in there as well. But
Sure.
But the other story I remember vividly, and this kind of speaks to my resilience, I think, as a human being. At 13, and I don't remember the whole instance of what happened leading up to it. I'm sure I did something, by the way. I was 13, but I remember my dad backed me into the sink and he poked my chest 2 or 3 times. And I said, if you ever effing touch me, and we never swore in the house, it was the kids never swore. But I said, if you effing touch me again, I'm leaving. And he slapped me and I walked out the door and I hear my mom screaming, Craig, go get him. And I run up the street and I run around the corner and he gets in his car and he's like, get in the car. And I'm yelling, are you going to hit me again? Are you? And what was fascinating is that shame that I put on my dad, because the neighbors heard it. He never touched me again, except for one other time when I was 18, but I totally deserved it. And I knew I deserved it when he hit me, slapped me, I guess is probably a better way to say it. Because I said something derogatory to my mom and I deserved it when I said it. But I mean, it was interesting that at that moment I had the strength to stand up to a man that was hugely scary to me as a child. So that was another crucible moment of saying, okay, I'm not going to take it anymore.
So you had some challenging circumstances in your family, brother, dad, but we say, and I'm sure you say, I know you say, when you're faced with a crucible, you have a choice. And I love the fact that one of the people on there said something about, I forget who it was, choice to wallow or not. I mean, I swear, I use that word wallow all the time. It's the weirdest thing. I'm reading this, wow.
Every week.
Yeah. And, hide under the covers and let the next 30, 40, 50 years go by until it's all over. Or to say, gosh, this is awful, but I'm going to go in a different direction. You chose a different path. I mean, just you mentioned just getting through school, college, PhD. It wasn't easy. There are some people that it's like studying is just easy. 4.0s is like breathing. I mean, it's like, I mean, I'm blessed. I did undergrad degree at Oxford and Harvard Business School and all. Well, I had to study. I remember there was this English guy that, drinking age is 18 in the UK. Yeah. So, drinking himself silly most of the day. And he would get like perfect grades. And he never studied, but he was just a genius. Well, that wasn't me. And seeming it wasn't you. So it's just, I find that all fascinating that your path to writing this book, your path to getting a PhD, none of it was easy. But yet, how did that serve you? That, life wasn't easy, even in your chosen path of academia, in a sense.
There's something deep inside me, and it's probably as unhealthy as it is. The PhD is a great example. I wanted to prove people wrong who thought that I wasn't smart. And I thought by getting 3 additional letters behind my name would prove those people wrong. And lo and behold, they didn't prove a damn thing. They didn't really care. And so I gave weight to a bunch of people that really didn't matter. And you're laughing because I feel like maybe you can relate to that a little bit.
Well, right. I mean, I have an Oxford degree and a Harvard MBA, but did that help me when the company went under? No, I thought I was a moron. It actually made it worse. How could a Harvard MBA make such massively stupid decisions? Yeah. And we're talking, I graduated in, May, June 87. I launched the takeover in late August 87. It wasn't like, it was 20 years after. He's probably forgotten his classes. Well, no. Yeah. We're talking a couple months. Yeah. I mean, golly. So, yes, I can relate. It didn't make me feel it made me feel worse, actually, having the credentials.
Yeah. Well, I even can imagine that situation, like, you're making this, I've met enough Harvard MBAs where there's sometimes, I won't say generally speaking, I'm going to say generally speaking, not always, there's a bit of arrogance from it, right? That guy's from Harvard, I know it. And then to walk out and basically make a big mistake, like that has to hurt your ego a bit.
Oh, it does. It gives you a bit of humility. So, and you spent some time in Western Australia. Did you get your PhD there, or was that?
At University of Western Australia.
Right, and that was a remarkable experience. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about the book, because I love the fact that you had this,
Can I stop
Please
just for 1 second there before we get to the book? Because there's something you told me, James, and we talked beforehand that I thought was really fascinating. There's a couple things. You were talking about what you went through as a young man in your, in your teens and your 20s, and you mentioned just now about your resilience. But as Warwick said, we just finished a series on resilience, and one of the things that two of our guests said who have researched resilience scientifically is that it's not just about digging down deep inside yourself. True resilience is also, yes, you find some power, some strength within, but you also reach without. You reach for the resources around you. You told me something about in your 20s. I want to find the exact quote where you said that guys in their 20s, empathy isn't part of their skill set. So as you were trying to find your resilience, it was hard for you, wasn't it, to find it kind of in your peer group, because us guys in our 20s aren't always prepared to provide that kind of support to our friends.
Yeah. My dad died when I was 20. I was at university. He died relatively quick, within 6 months. He had a congestive heart failure. He didn't make the cut to get a heart transplant. Then he did, and then he passed away. So it was quite sudden. My parents had moved from, I grew up in Portland. They moved to Chicago. I went to college, but my dad had just taken a transfer with his company down to Atlanta. So, he dies that summer. I go back to school, and not many men in their 20s has dealt with their parent dying. Right. So there was just this gap of like empathy and understanding and connecting. I was a captain of the water polo team. I lived with 6 guys, and it just was this void of understanding. And unfortunately or fortunately, I kind of always think things happen for a reason. I really delved into drinking for about 3 to 5 years as a way to cope. One of my perceived skills, I say a skill for evil, if you will. I was really good at the college wooing, if you will. And so I would find myself worth in getting girls to like me, and then, we would hook up or whatever. But my worth was tied up into getting that chase because I didn't feel valued or wanted. And that's where my value came from. And unfortunately, I hurt a lot of people in that phase of my life. And so that lack of empathy and connection and understanding was really hard. Fast forward a few years, and my mom's calling me saying, I want to commit suicide. And I'm like, I can't deal with this. Like, I'm barely keeping it together myself, And my response to my mom probably wasn't the nicest, but I was like, hey, if you're going to do it, or go get help. But I can't help you right now. I was like, I'm not someone who's in a position to take care of his mom in her mid 50s. I'm trying to sort my own self out in my early 20s. And so the drinking really culminated in, I don't even know the year, but I was 24, 25 when I got a DUI driving home. I remember the story really vividly. I was out on the other side of town. My mom lived in Vancouver, Washington at this time. She had moved back from Atlanta back to where we grew up. And so she was in Vancouver, and I was in downtown Portland driving back, and I'd gone out after work, and I was coming home, and I was really close to my house, probably a quarter mile. And in my head, I was Mario Andretti, or in today's parlance, you probably could say like, oh my gosh, the Formula One driver that wins everything.
Lewis Hamilton?
Yeah, Lewis Hamilton. I was trying to modernize the story a little bit. At the time, I thought I was Mario Andretti, and there was this little S-turn by my house, and I was going probably 70 in a 35, and the police officer whips around. I see him, and I thought in my head, if I can get home before he gets to me and I get in the house, he'll never know I was there. Like that
Sanctuary.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was like, I can make it. And so I get there. This is such a funny story. So I get there, the lights come on. My mom's in a very residential, like Leave It to Beaver neighborhood, lights come on. I'm in the car. My mom had just started dating this guy, and he comes out in his t-shirt and tighty whities. What's going on here? And I was like, oh my goodness, So I ended up going to jail for the night, get out. And the police officer was super nice. He's like, I'm really sorry to do this. I'm like, nope, I broke the law. It's my fault. Like, I was really accountable to the moment. So the consequence of that, and leading to the consequence of this, is that I had to go to an outpatient program for 2 years. And so the first 6 months was 4 nights a week, 3 hours a night, super intensive. Then it was 6 months, once a week for 3 hours. And then it was a therapist for the next year. And I think at the time, kind of going to your point, Gary, I think at the time I really had a choice on how I was going to approach that. I think most 24-year-olds would have been real bitter and resentful. I chose to say, this is an opportunity. And this is that 2 and 4 statement, right? It happened for me, it happened to me. Right. And I really said this was a for me moment, and really dove into that as an opportunity to really start to peel back the layers of the onions of myself and try to understand, what am I trying to do, and why am I acting this way, and what's wrong with me, and all of those things that you kind of have in your early 20s that still kind of follow you in your 40s, and now if you're in your 50s, like sometimes it follows you as you go. So I think, Gary, to answer your question in this long-winded way, I figured out at some point in my life, for whatever reason, that you have to look inside you, but you also have to accept things for what they are and what they are not. And there's a nice serenity prayer, right? Have the wisdom to know the difference, is what I always hold on to, of what you can and can't control. And so there's things when I can control it and it's wrong, I'm accountable. When I can't, I have to let it go. And I think that's kind of where I sit with a lot of my life and choices and outcomes, is if it's bad, it happened for me. If it is good, it's happened for me. But I think when you move from I'm a victim to a victor, there's a huge change and shift mentally in your mind that happens. And I think quite often, and I'm guessing, Warwick, this was you for quite a while, is you were a victim, of your own circumstances and whatever. And so it happened to me. And I just think psychologically that's really tough to manage over a long period of time.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, thanks for sharing that. I mean, I started thinking if this book, Crucible's Gift, was a movie and they talk about, the flashback, the origin, you've obviously had a number of crucibles. Would that be like, if you had to do, a 2-minute origin flashback, would that be the scene going on these back roads near, I think, Vancouver, Washington, and the DUI? Would that be like, if you had to pick one crucible story that said, okay, this is where I made a choice, I'm not going to cry and complain about this. I'm going to move in a positive direction.
That is such a hard question for me. Because, I could go back to my earliest crucible was being exposed to pornography,
right?
At like 9 years old, 10 years old, like right. That has a direct long-term impact. Right. I think that if I was to say the moment of where I realized I had probably more control of how I responded was with my dad at 13. I think that was a point of saying, oh, my strength made a difference in his response. Okay. On some deep level. But I mean, Warwick, you would probably agree that yes, your big crucible was that event, but then you got married. That's a different that's a healthy crucible, right? And then you have kids. That's a healthy, but they're all chaotic and you feel out of control, but they're all in good,
Yeah. No, I mean, it's so well said. And I want to turn here to your book, but just by way of illustration, yes, you could say the biggest crucible for me was launching the takeover in 1987. But as listeners would know, there was an earlier crucible 11 years before, in 1976, where some other family members threw my dad off as chairman of the family company. They had enough shares that, they could get together and throw him off. I was 15 at the time, and I mean, I loved my dad, and, I was just devastated. I mean, how could they do this to him? I mean, okay, talk about it. They feel like there should be a shift, but don't just throw him off. So, I mean, and then it's like, well, since he's off, at that moment, I was, in my parents' eyes, the heir apparent. So it was crushing for me emotionally, loving my dad, but then it was like, it's now me. Not yet, but it will be. So the reality of what I was headed to in my future crucible, though I didn't quite know what would happen, came then. So yes, it was a foreshadowing of later Crucibles. But so one of the things I'm fascinated by, I mean, so much of everything you've done, I'm fascinated by, but you chose an interesting path to writing this book, The Crucible's Gift. You decide, well, let me interview a bunch of people, which, that people do that when they write books, but you did it through a podcast, Executive After Hours. And I love that the term you use, because from what I understand, it's like, well, I don't want to just know who they are 9 to 5, but who are they really at home with their families? I mean, who is the real man or woman leader? So, and then I sense you had an idea for the book, but the exact nature of it changed partway through. So talk a bit about just what made you decide to write this book at all, and use this interesting mode of a podcast as a research method. So how did this whole thing start, this passion for crucibles and writing about it?
So it did shift. I think I was going to try to write a traditional leadership book of some sort, like that was my interest. But what I realized as I was interviewing these leaders, and the tagline of the podcast was, I care about who you are, not what you do, because who you are defines what you do. And as I was doing the podcast, I was more interested and curious at dissecting their problems than their job. I didn't really care about like, oh, what makes you a great leader? That wasn't interesting to me. Because I think as you've noted, a person's story is way more interesting than being a CEO or being a bank clerk, whatever their choice of living is, which is totally fine. The exciting part is always their story. Like, how did you get there? And my favorite part of the podcast was always listening to their story and then get to the end and do a wrap up of saying, so I saw when you were 12, this happened, and it seems like you're reflecting that at 37. Is this the case of what I'm hearing and seeing? And they'd be like, yes, I never thought of that. And that to me was kind of like my juice. I was like, yes, I'm listening well, I'm connecting the dots, and they're getting someplace new and different. And so, not to take a page out of Dax Shepard, but I really felt like an armchair expert in psychology while I was doing this. And so for me, it was really fun. And so the notion of writing about people's crucibles spun the idea of, well, what made them be better at whatever they were doing? How do those crucibles help? And that's where kind of that framework of the model came up, was diving into the literature, reading a bunch of books, and kind of layering that with stories that kind of supported what I found.
Did you almost feel like maybe forensic accountant isn't the right word, but maybe Sherlock Holmes, but somehow you were trying to understand, okay, these folks are great leaders in the holistic sense of the word, not just in numbers, but as human beings, how they treat people, self-aware, all of the things, compassion, all the things you have in your model. Yeah. Where did that come from? And you start digging in their background and their story, and it felt like you had story after story where you found some, maybe it was an example, or maybe it was a reaction to what happened, and said, look, I'm not going to do that. I think there was one case, I forget, maybe a set of twins, and one went one way and the other went the other. I mean, you had these fascinating,
Virgin Mary and her sisters.
You hear that a lot in families, right? My brother or sister went one way, but I chose to go a different. I can't tell you how many times I'm sure we both heard that, but that's fascinating. That must have been fascinating just as you dug into the sort of Sherlock Holmes. Where did all this come from?
I love that framing though. That's what I felt like. And I also think you touched on something else that was really interesting. I wasn't defining leaders by numbers and by size of paycheck. I was defining them by human beings, right? So really that framework I came up with, though it's couched in the terms of authentic leader, it's really about just being an authentic human. And for me, they blur together. And so, the model was developed in a sense that like every good leadership book should have a model. That's kind of what I was being told. So, but it made sense to me, and really the core of that whole entire book is the growth mindset. That really is everything. Without it, you're stagnant. Without it, you don't embrace, you don't use it happened for me. You say it happened to me. Without a growth mindset and open to the possibilities of what could be if you think about something differently and ask different questions, And I found that those leaders that made the book, that made the cut, were really asking the questions of, why did this happen? What is the learning? How can I use this? And so as I wrote the book, I had a clear sense of lens of what I think a good human being would look like based on, and it's super subjective. You could add 25 other features to this thing by all means. But from my perspective, that was kind of the path or spiral to authenticity, if you will.
Yeah, I love that concept. I know you talk later, I think it's in chapter 6, learning about Carol Dweck and the whole growth mindset, which I think is partly what you're talking about. You say growth mindset is when a person basically continues want to learn and desire mastery, likes feedback, and a fixed mindset, performance, and they certainly don't like feedback. So, I mean, there is this choice that people make to learn from what they went through. I mean, one of the things we talk about is, for me, I had to go, well, why did I end up this way? And I had to learn, gosh, I'm not a Rupert Murdoch, take no prisoners chief executive. I'm a reflective advisor. So it was a terrible fit. I wasn't living my own vision. I wasn't even living my dad's vision. I was living a vision 5 generations, 150 years before John Fairfax, who was an entrepreneur. Those entrepreneurial genes kind of faded over the generations. They became extinct, really. We were more like philosophy professors, not entrepreneurs. It just died. So, I mean, there were so many lessons. It's just I was living somebody else's vision. I wasn't living a lot of my design. So, but I could have said, oh, woe is me. But I basically brought a lot of trouble on myself. I was like, okay, this was awful. But eventually, now what am I going to do? I was like 30 years old. I mean, what am I going to do now? So, yeah, you have to make a choice. So I love so let's just start with Crucible, because I love your definition there. And I think the guy who wrote the foreword, he puts it this way. James Kelley defines a crucible as a significant moment, positive or negative impact, which forces a leader to become introspective, assess their strengths and weaknesses, leading them to become more self-aware. So I feel like one of the core theses, if you will, about a crucible is there's an opportunity to become self-aware. So talk about that, because that feels like that is one of the core premises of your book, which I completely agree with.
Yeah. So, but this dovetails on really what I said before. To be self-aware, you've got to be open-minded. You've got to have a growth mindset. So that's why, not that the audience can see it, but there's like 3 rings in my model. The middle ring is the crucible, and the next ring out is really the half and half of growth mindset versus self-awareness. And, there are different types of self-awareness. There's a self-awareness of, that's not my fault, which isn't really self-awareness, it's other awareness. And then there's self-awareness of, where is the learning that can happen in this? If I was to put my philosophy hat on, if you will, as I still have the entrepreneurial genes, but I'd love to be more of a philosopher. The reality is of self-awareness is that it's the scariest thing, because you might find something you don't like, but you also can equally find something that you love. And I think it's knowing the difference is really important, and embracing both. If your aim is perfection, you're going to be miserable your whole life, because nothing's perfect. If your aim is just to be a better version of you, accepting what you're not great at, but work on being better at it, that's a much better way to live. It's much more tolerant and way kinder to yourself. When I talk about compassion in the book, I talk about self-compassion is probably one of the most important things. And I struggle at it. Like, I am my own worst critic. I'm hardest on myself.
So is Warwick. That's why he's laughing. So is Warwick. Yeah. He's his own worst critic.
Amen.
Yeah, I mean, it's unhealthy, but it just is what it is. And so I think the goal in life is to be more self-compassionate as you get older, but it's not easy.
No,
Warwick,
please go ahead.
Before we leave the subject of how Crucible is defined in James's book, I looked up how Crucible is defined by you in your book, Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Lead a Life of Significance, which came out on October 19th. And here's how it's described in your book. And listen, some of the same words is fascinating. This is what you wrote, Warwick. Moments that bring us to a critical crossroads in our lives and provide invaluable opportunities to reflect, reassess, and redefine our purpose and vision in life and leadership. That's your definition of a crucible. And it's right. I mean, you guys are both onto something that is not just your opinion, but is based on lived reality that so many people have been through.
No, it's so true.
And just to add to that, one of the things in Warwick, you're probably the poster child for this, by the way. One of the things that I think is most fascinating is that not everyone embraced their crucible in the moment. It'd be 10 years. It might be 20 years. Right. And so it's never in the moment that, like in the moment, it's terror, it's freak, it's scary, it's this, it's that. But as time and distance goes from that, it's the ability to look back and ask that question that's really important and pertinent. And that's the thing I think that you've done over time, that I've done over time. And that's what I found in the book. The person who wrote the foreword, Joe Burton, he was a high-flying executive by 40 years old, but he was broken. He was broken as a man, broken as a body. Like, he was broken. And he had to go back and look to his childhood to figure out why he was how he was and uncover that crucible to redirect his life. But it took him 10, 15, 20 years to get to that point.
No, it's so true. I mean, through a lot of the 90s, I wasn't so much blaming other people. I mean, yes, there was instability in the family for decades, and I could point to all that. But for me, it was just like, how could I have been so dumb? How could I have been so dumb? How could I think that doing a $2 billion takeover, that the rest of my or other family members would want to stay in a privatized company run by a 26-year-old? I mean, come on, I had Harvard MBA. I mean, how could I have been so dumb? So that was a lot of it.
Was that ego?
No, it was, for me, it was more youthful naivety and idealism. It was feeling like the company is not being run along the ideals of the founder, who is a person of great faith. I was too, so not so much, Jesus lives on the front pages, but more just in terms of how people are treated in the company and, the quality of the newspaper. But it was just this sense of, as my parents believed too, the vision is straight from the founder. I wanted to see the company be well managed or better managed. So it was more youthful naivety, idealism with a bit of a crusader mentality. It wasn't about money or power, or it's like, I'll still work in the marketing planning department while it's, you guys keep your titles. And it was all very naive, but it was idealistic. The intentions, I think, were good, but it was a lot of bad things can happen with good intentions. But yeah, I mean, to your point about bouncing back, just this self-awareness, I know for me, and from my faith perspective, sort of anchored in my Christian faith, I had to go from I screwed up God's plan, because I felt like, God had this plan to restore the company, the deals of the founder. Poor theology, if you wanted it to happen, it would have, despite my mistakes and stupidity. But really, the core of me reclaiming my self-esteem and self-awareness is God loves me, and I believe every human on the planet unconditionally, not because of what we do, just because we're human. As humans, we have innate worth, and beyond Christianity, I think most major religions, philosophies believe in the worth of a human being, per se. So when you find your self-esteem outside of accomplishments, just because you have value in of itself as a father, mother, husband, wife, just human, that was key for me. Just, we have intrinsic worth from my perspective, there's a certain faith hue to it. So and then that makes self-awareness easier. Like, there's a lot of things I'm bad at. I'm more of a reflective advisor. I'm not, I'm okay athletically, but not great. Well, over time, it's like, it's okay. I'm not that great at golf. I don't really like playing in golf competitions, even lighthearted ones. I guess I get all, I just play slower and worse. So that's okay. I don't do that. I don't really play much golf anymore. So I've come to accept that it's okay to be me, and not try and avoid envying people that are different, maybe more outgoing or whatever. So part of maybe the growth mindset, long-winded way of obviously saying I agree with you, is accepting who you are and not basing your self-esteem on others' opinions or some outward thing, have it within or from a faith origin, And then it makes self-awareness a little easier. Does any of that make sense at all?
Yeah. No, it makes tons of sense for sure. Yeah.
So, So
I want to jump in just for a second because Warwick says this all the time, James, and I never get this opportunity to have someone who understands this stuff as well as Warwick does. And you've interviewed all of these people. You've written this book about how people process their crucibles, how they move past them, move beyond them. And one of the things Warwick says that I'm always a little sad to hear him say, not that he's being authentic and he's acknowledging mistakes, but he often says, "I was stupid," and that always strikes me as perhaps not the emotional wisest place to be. It's great to be authentic, and Warwick is one of the most authentic people I know. But that self degradation, if you will, I don't know.
Self-talk.
Is that, in your experience, in who you've talked to, for our listeners, not just for Warwick, but for our listeners, is that helpful, or are there better ways to go about that?
No, I think you should be harder on yourself, Warwick. I think you should actually call yourself those names. I feel like that's a loaded question, Gary. Of course it's not helpful. But it goes back to that idea of acceptance, right? Like, you said something, Gary, that I thought was really interesting, and I know you weren't trying to be flippant with the words, like they move on from crucibles, they whatever. To me, you don't move on, you accept them. And I know that's a small difference in language, but it really matters in this because you can't ever leave them behind. That's a scar on your back, right?
Absolutely.
And Gary, you have your scars, and you shared a little bit about your story with me when we did a pre-interview. Like, we all have scars, and it's the ownership of them. That's the brilliance. That's the best part, because that ownership is the experience that allows you to be a better version of yourself.
Absolutely.
And so, I never want to minimize my crucibles. I mean, geez, I've lived on 4 continents, and I've drug my kids to 2 different continents, in the last 5 years. And, like, their crucibles are equally their scars on their back, good or bad as it might be. And so I think they're essential. I think, again, the point I keep going back to, and I think is so relevant, and it drives the self-awareness, is the ability to accept them for the goodness in them, not the badness in them. You hear of stories of women and men who've been abused or raped or whatever. And those that say, hey, you know what, that was a blessing because of X. I didn't enjoy it. It wasn't great. I would never want it on anybody else, but it made me a better version of myself because of Y, and those people I love so much because they have every right to hate and detest and, be negative, but they choose not to. And for me, you can see that gets me really fired up. For me, it's so important for our world to stop hanging on to what's wrong, right? Like, we just hang on to all the crap and all the disagreements and it's just not helpful for anybody. And I'm going to step down off my soapbox, and we can keep going.
No. I think what you said is just so profound. I want listeners to reflect on this because, one of the things you talk about is just this growth and gratitude. And part of that, obviously, is acceptance, and then seeing some blessings that have come through that. Yeah, I mean, we've interviewed maybe 70 plus guests of every kind of background, gender, race, from a Navy SEAL that was paralyzed in a training accident to victims of abuse, business failure, every kind of crucible you can imagine. And the journey back is always the same and very much in line with what you write. It's acceptance, but somehow finding meaning in it, finding purpose. I mean, we had a woman on a few weeks ago, and we have a few Australians. Funnily enough, I don't know why we have so many Australians on the podcast.
There's been like 5 Australians and 1 person from Wisconsin, where I'm from.
Yeah. I don't know why that happens. But anyway, she was paralyzed, was diagnosed as a quadriplegic at age 13 in a diving accident, just an above ground pool. Parents kept saying, her name is Stacy Kopass, Stacy, stop doing that, stop doing that. You know what kids, when they're 13, they're not going to listen to their parents. Well, this had lifelong consequences. So obviously she went through years of, oh my gosh, what did I do? And had some substance issues, which she talks about, which understandable. But she now says that what she went through was a gift. And you've obviously heard this before, but this is stunning. How could being diagnosed as a quadriplegic be a gift? But so many of them, they see blessings in what they went through. And for me, it's only recently that I'm thinking maybe what I went through was a blessing or a gift. Because I don't know, a few months ago, I said it can be useful but a gift. But
that's exactly what you said, because I put it in a press release and you're like, I don't think it was a gift.
So finally, I'm trying to grow and learn myself. But for me, the turning point, just by way of analogy, was 2008. Again, listeners would have heard this, but 2008 at my church, the pastor, it was like a 2,000 plus evangelical church. The pastor was giving a message on the life of David. He was, Saul was trying to kill him because he was doing a good job. And this day and age, if your boss doesn't like what you're doing because you're showing him up, they typically don't kill you, but they did back then,
I'm glad we've modernized our situations.
It's like, I'm fired. I can take being fired. Just don't kill me. But anyways, he was feeling bad about himself. So he wanted some illustration of a righteous person falsely persecuted. Well, that's not me. I made a lot of my own mistakes. But the point of the story is I shared my story in about 7 to 10 minutes of growing up in Australia in a big family media business that nobody had ever heard of. But obviously, Australia's a long way away. But weeks and months after, people came up to me and said, Warwick, what you shared was so helpful. Well, how many former media moguls are there in the audience? Like none? Yeah. It's one thing to say you're a cancer survivor or abuse survivor.
Well,
there
was one in the audience.
Me. But
yeah.
Sadly, some crucibles, so many people have gone through. The point of the whole story is, if by sharing my story and writing my book, which was unbelievably painful, it took years to write, because imagine writing about in exhaustive detail about your worst experiences, which you've done some of, so you get it. But if my pain can help others, now that motivated me. And I talk about there's some healing in being able to use your pain to help others. So all that's to say is, as you can see a blessing and a gift in what you've been through, that was part of my journey back. And I mean, I'm assuming that's your experience with the people you've interviewed, and just the benefit of seeing what you've been through is having some gratitude.
Can I comment on something you just said that was really interesting?
Yeah.
This epic failure, let's be clear, it was an epic failure,
sure.
Right? Crucible. You're talking 10, 15, how many years later before 2008 from that?
Yeah.
Was it 20 years, 10 years?
Well, it was 1990 that the company went under, so I don't know, whatever that is, 18 years later.
So almost 20 years, right?
Yeah.
So what that says to me, though, is that you never had acceptance.
Maybe.
Right? Like if it's still painful for you to talk about it 20 years later and write about it, then there's that level of acceptance of it is what it is, and then move on, right? So for me, as we kind of open the show, my acceptance of my failures happened pretty quick. Now I may blame myself for them, but I accept it. Like it is what it is. And so for me, that's a great sign that if you're now shifting from kind of it happened to me to it's a gift, it happened for me, it's unpacking and unraveling that package and pulling out those gifts and sharing them, which is what it sounds like you're starting to do now. And that's my point about, like, time doesn't care about your crucible. It's you have to make the decision of how you're going to open that gift or not.
Well, and I feel like acceptance doesn't, for most people, certainly for me, didn't happen overnight. It was a growth process.
Yeah.
Step by step. I mean, there was a time in the 90s when, I got invitation to Oxford reunions and Harvard Business School reunions. I wouldn't go. I was too embarrassed. I feel like, being like a leper, unclean, leave the town. And I eventually went to one, and it's like, it was okay, because, there are other Harvard MBAs have actually had business failures. Who knew? Maybe not quite so epic, but so I'm just trying, there's so much in this. I love, obviously, we talked a bit about crucibles, self-awareness. You talk about the public versus the private self, which I get, the public persona, but round out some of these other things you have, because you've got integrity, compassion, relatableness, great word, learning, which you've talked about. What are some of the other parts of the model that really are the keys to being an authentic leader?
Yeah. So, to unpack that a little bit, the compassion to me is really important. And initially the book started with empathy as the main core idea. But I kind of said, compassion means you want to remove that person's pain. You want to really try to figure out how you can help them. And in doing compassion, that's a level of selflessness. And in selflessness, there's actually joy, and giving is joy. And so I kind of wanted to make that leap to say, if you really want to be a better version of yourself, give yourself to someone else in a way that's helpful for them. When we speak about relatableness and integrity, I think integrity goes without saying, but I'm really narrow on integrity, and this is probably a reflection of my life. The biggest thing I see in business and I see in interactions is follow through with the request you made or the promise you have. Too often people give themselves outs. Yeah, I'll email you later, and then they don't. And it's those little tiny micro things that actually have a huge weight on how people perceive you. Too often, I hate the phrase, hey, let's meet up for a drink. Hey, let's go get coffee. But you don't really mean it. Like, you're not going to really do it. So then why say it, And then it becomes this parlance of like, it's totally acceptable that you're never going to see that person again, but you're going to say these things because it's the polite thing to say. And I think there's just other ways to go about not falsifying the intent, if you will. So for me, integrity is really the micro things that are the most important thing. I think macro, yes, we could agree. Killing's bad. Yes, I think that's pretty clear. So there's the macro levels of integrity, but the relatableness one for me is really the most important one. As a PhD in consumer psychology, a lot of this was based on research that was backed up by interviews. And what I found was the value in relationships far exceed anything else. And I use a phrase in the book called micro moments of meaning. And for me, it's such a critical piece of who I am. And I'm not always great at it, but the premise of micro moments of meaning is that when you engage in a conversation, one-on-one, two-on-one, when you leave that conversation, leaving the other people smiling or laughing, there's a neurological impact that happens on their brain. And the research suggests that when you leave a conversation with two people and they're smiling or laughing, they're more likely to replicate that with the next person they talk to. And so it becomes this spider web of positivity that you can embed in someone by creating that micro moment of meaning. It may not mean a lot for you, but it could mean a lot for them. And that kind of goes back to the compassion side of being of service of others. That's my Jesuit background, being of service of others. And so the relatableness is about creating those micro moments of meaning that have a long-term impact, because that's also the last way they remember you, right? So that smile, so that's their last memory. That's their most immediate interaction with you. So that means that that's how they're going to frame you in their mind, as the funny, nice, kind, happy person. And so that's really important, I think, as a way to leave somebody in a moment.
Yeah,
I am going to try to interject a micro moment of meaning here by saying, and hopefully it'll leave you with a smile on your face, James, when I'm done talking. But the captain has turned on the fasten seatbelt sign. It is time to begin preparing the cabin for landing. But before I do that, I would be remiss if I did not give you a chance, James, to let listeners know how they can find out more about you, the services you offer, and particularly where they can find your book. Because obviously you and Warwick traffic in some of the same stuff, and there's great wisdom in both. So how can they find out more about you?
Yeah, so the book is on Amazon, and it's got the digital, the audiobook is great. I hired 3 actors to come in and act out the different scenes, the different stories in the book. So that makes the book really fun and engaging, because it's not just a voice. So I really encourage the audiobook out of all of them if you do it, but the book is on Amazon. In terms of me, you can always reach out to me at jkelley, Kelley, at qchange.com. It's the letter Q and then change.com. As for what I do and what we do as a company, we're really in the business of impacting people at the point of choice. And so what does that mean? Our product or solution helps leaders be better at their job by giving them prompts, and behavioral prompts, soft skill prompts, immediately before a meeting. But then after the meeting, we're asking them, did you do this? We ask those around them, did you see this? and we allow them to grow in the flow of work, not intrusively, just twice a day. But what's great about it from an individual level is that you can get that repetitive behavior prompting that you need to be better at being a better version of yourself. In our solution, we have a whole authentic leadership area. So if someone's trying to be an authentic leader, they have those options to work on beyond DE&I and communication and strategy. So, that's what we do. We're in Microsoft Teams, and that's our main platform that we, sell our product in. So yeah, it's awesome. And we've got a ton of great feedback around it. And I wouldn't tell you if we had bad feedback anyway, so don't worry about it.
Oh, good. Well, thank you so much, James. I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about integrity, compassion, relatableness, that I often think, to me, with great leaders, there's something that fuels them, not just because it's a good way to be successful in the holistic sense of the word, but it comes from values. It could be a faith perspective or maybe an example from childhood. But I know for me, one of my highest values is treating everybody with dignity and respect. And so I'm not perfect. I have my bad days like we all do.
Sure.
And I can be cranky and obstinate, but I really try to know what's happening. And so I think that's what you're talking about with relatableness. Gee, I'm sorry, how was the weekend? Oh, your kid was sick. Oh, wow, really? That's awful. The next day, so, how is your daughter? Is she better now? How was that sore throat? Was it, or strep? Was strep? Oh, really? I mean, you ask, you follow up, not because you try to, be successful, because it's the right thing to do out of your set of values. If it's out of your intrinsic values, you're not going to forget, because you will do it because you want to do it. And same with the integrity. I love your definition, do plus say equals trust. Again, that comes out of values that, if you say you're going to do something, then do it, because it's the right thing to do. If you say you're going to call somebody, then it comes out of and being compassionate. Again, I love that sense. Empathy is fine, but compassion is like empathy in action, if you will. Yeah. So all of these things relate to us. I don't know if it's a worldview, but just a desire, a certain set of values. And maybe even, I guess my sort of last question as we sort of try and sum all this up, which is a challenge because there's so much here. With Crucible's Gift, what's the biggest lesson that you would want people to have as they read this book and reflect on it? What's the biggest lesson you would offer people in Crucible's Gift?
It's good. You're making them think. That's good, Warwick.
Yeah. Sorry, is this silence awkward for everyone?
Not at all.
No, the plane is just circling the runway. We're good.
That's it. Everyone's seatbelts are buckled. Yeah, I think the biggest lesson I want someone to get is be open. Be open to the possibility of what if there's a different narrative you could tell yourself? What if there's a different question you could be asking yourself? What if the crucible that has held you back is untethered and is actually that opportunity? So just what if?
And that was the sound of the plane touching down. There you go. Please gather up your belongings and we'll see you the next time. Listeners, thank you for spending time with us on this episode of Beyond the Crucible. And I have some homework for you. Rather than takeaways from the episode, I have some homework for you. I love this idea that James talked about micro moments of meaning. So the homework from those of us at Beyond the Crucible is go out today and find at least 3 opportunities that you can leave someone with a micro moment of meaning. Flip back to the podcast, back up, hear James describe it so you know exactly what you're looking to do. But let's do some of that to each other. I think we can really turn around a lot of people's days if we do that, and it connects to, and like the old, talk about dating ourselves, the old shampoo commercials, and they told 2 friends and so on and so on and so on. If everybody passes that along, it could make a great impact. So until the next time we are together, please do remember this. As we've discussed here, your crucible experiences are painful. And they're not easily overcome in most cases. You've heard us talk about it in every episode of the show, and you've heard James and Warwick talk about it today. But they can be overcome. The key is your perspective on what the crucible means to you. Did it happen to you, or did something happen for you? Can you learn the lessons of it, apply those lessons, and move forward? Because when you do, it's not the end of your story. It's not the worst chapter of your story even. It's a new chapter that can become the best chapter of your story. Because where it leads in the end, as you follow the road on that journey, is to a life of significance.